You wake to the sound of bronze chains shifting against marble. Cold morning light filters through narrow windows of a Roman villa perched high upon the Palatine Hill, perhaps around 120 AD. The air smells faintly of incense burned in the atrium shrine, mingling with the sour tang of last night's wine. Your limbs ache from service at the banquet that carried on deep into the night, when you poured wine into gilded cups for senators who spoke about you as if you were a chair, a vessel, an object, not a boy. At 16, your youth is your only currency. For years earlier, at 12, you were sold in the slave market at Delos, a boy from the Greek islands, purchased for the staggering sum of 40,000 sestertii, more than most free citizens could hope to earn in a lifetime. That figure was not just a price. It was a brand, a measure of expectation and exploitation. You remember the tears of your first master when bankruptcy forced him to sell you. He wept not from love, but from the collapse of an investment, as if he were watching a prized racehorse leave the stables. Now you live in this Roman villa, where beauty is treated as capital and youth as a perishable luxury. In Rome, there was a word whispered with fascination and disdain: delicatus. Our modern languages can only half capture its meaning. Delicate boy misses the sharp edges hidden in the term, the way it carried legal, social, and erotic weight all at once. Some historians argue that the word concubinus comes closer, but even that fails to convey the reality: a young male slave trained and maintained for intimate service, both public and private. We know of them not through their own words, those voices are lost to history, but through fragments left by others, the moral scoldings of philosophers like Seneca the Younger, the strict regulations of Roman legal codes, the occasional epitaph carved on gravestones that hint at a tenderness never free from ownership. Literature tells us even more. The poet Martial, with his biting wit, describes banquets where boys like you stood silent for hours, the glow of lamps catching the oils rubbed into your skin. To the Romans, you were an ornament and an object, fragile yet necessary to the performance of elite life. Marcus Terentius Varro, the imperial tutor under Augustus, once observed that to understand Rome's system of slavery was to recognize the gradations of degradation. An agricultural slave might break his back in the fields, but a delicatus faced a breaking of a different kind, one less visible to the eye yet equally brutal. The whip was not your greatest fear. It was the constant awareness that every gesture, every movement of your body, every hint of rebellion or aging could determine your fate. Your survival depended upon beauty, and that very beauty guaranteed exploitation. It was a paradox built into the system. To be valuable was to be vulnerable. Youth was the gold coin that kept you alive, but the passing of years meant obsolescence. Education and refinement were demanded of you. You were expected to quote poetry, to smile with intelligence at the right moment, but too much wit, too much cleverness, could be seen as dangerous. You were required to shine, but never outshine. This system was not hidden in the shadows. Roman society celebrated it openly. At feasts, at theaters, at the baths, boys like you were displayed beside their masters as symbols of wealth, like marble statues that breathed and suffered. Even the most respected citizens of Rome saw nothing scandalous in it. To them, it was civilization itself, the organization of pleasure, status, and power. And so, as the morning sun warms the marble floor beneath your bare feet, you begin another day in silence, a living reminder that in ancient Rome, civilization and cruelty walked hand in hand, chained together like the bronze links clinking softly in the dawn. Roman slavery was not a single condition. It was a spectrum of suffering, a hierarchy where one form of bondage was measured against another. The jurist Gaius, writing in the 2nd century, once remarked that slavery was the natural opposite of freedom. But even within unfreedom there were degrees, gradations, and calculated cruelties. At the bottom were the familia rustica, field slaves. They lived and died on vast estates, bound to the soil like oxen. Their days were measured in furrows plowed, stones carried, vines pruned. Ancient writers often compared them to cattle, noting that their masters accounted for them in the same ledgers as livestock. Their lives were short, brutal, and anonymous. A Roman poet once wrote, "The fields drink more blood than wine," and he meant not metaphor but fact, bodies absorbed into the soil, their bones unmarked, their names unrecorded. Then came the domestic slaves, the familia urbana. They worked in kitchens, cleaned villas, and carried torches at night. They were seen more often, given scraps of culture and proximity to their masters, yet their intimacy offered no safety. It only meant more constant supervision, more opportunities to be beaten for a misplaced word or gesture. And higher still, precariously placed, were the delicati. If field slaves were anonymous muscle, delicati were curated spectacles. Their beauty set them apart, but it also chained them to a unique form of exploitation. They could not hide in the shadows. They were expected to shine under the lamps of the atrium, at the baths, in the company of senators and poets. Their masters invested in their bodies the way others invested in land or trade fleets. Oil for their skin, fine tunics for their form, tutors to polish their speech. Every expense was calculated to increase both pleasure and prestige. One Roman inscription, unearthed outside Pompeii, praises a boy called Antheus. Pulcherimus pure, delici patroni. The most beautiful boy, the delight of his patron. The epitaph is short, almost tender, but beneath it lies the reality of ownership. Even in death, his worth was measured only by how pleasing he had been to another. The philosopher Seneca, often hailed today as a voice of Stoic wisdom, left chilling words about these categories of suffering. He condemned masters who grew soft and decadent, yet he did not oppose the system itself. Instead, he scorned those who indulged too freely in the charms of their boys, warning that it weakened discipline. The problem, for Seneca, was not the exploitation of children. It was the risk of a master losing control over himself. Thus, slavery in Rome was never simply labor. It was performance, status, a living theater of hierarchy. The whip scar on a field slave's back, the polished smile of a household servant, the carefully oiled skin of a delicatus, all were visible reminders of Rome's power structure. The categories of slavery were categories of suffering, each tailored to maximize the master's benefit while ensuring the slave's dependence. And in this hierarchy, beauty was both a gift and a curse. For some, it spared them the mines or the fields. But for others, like you, it ensured that your body would never belong to yourself. Not in youth, not in age, not even in memory. Among the many tales whispered about Rome's emperors, none is more unsettling than the story of Sporus, a boy who became the grotesque centerpiece of Nero's hunger for domination. His life illustrates with painful clarity how beauty, once noticed by power, could become a prison without walls. Sporus was said to be delicate, striking, perhaps only 14 when Nero first saw him. His resemblance to Nero's deceased wife Poppaea Sabina was uncanny. Too uncanny for the emperor to ignore. Poppaea had died after a brutal episode in which Nero, in a fit of rage, kicked her to death while she was pregnant. Guilt did not restrain him. Instead, he sought a replacement, a mirror of what he had destroyed. And in Sporus, he found that reflection. Nero ordered the boy castrated, stripping him of the possibility of manhood. Castration was not new in Rome. Slaves and eunuchs had long been shaped to fit their master's desires, but here it took on a monstrous theatricality. Nero declared that Sporus would become his bride. A marriage ceremony was arranged with all the pomp of imperial Rome. Dowry, veils, attendants, even public witnesses. Suetonius tells us that the emperor himself played the role of husband, while the boy, mutilated and adorned, played the role of wife. The Roman historian Cassius Dio writes with disgust of the spectacle, describing how Sporus was paraded through the city in the robes of an empress, his hand held by the emperor as though he were Poppaea resurrected. Citizens watched, some in silence, others with forced applause. Rome, the center of civilization, had turned the life of a child into a cruel parody of marriage, a living mockery of love. What is most chilling is not simply Nero's perversion but Rome's complicity. Senators, generals, poets, they all attended, they all watched, they all pretended. The empire that conquered nations could not summon the courage to defy a tyrant's performance. And in the middle of it all stood Sporus, a boy who had no voice, no choice, no escape. After Nero's death, Sporus did not regain freedom. His fame as the emperor's wife clung to him like a chain. He was passed from one powerful man to another, each treating him as an ornament of power, a grotesque heirloom of Nero's excesses. At last, when another Roman sought to force him into yet another parody of marriage, Sporus chose death over further humiliation. He took his own life, silencing the role imposed upon him by emperors and elites. In Sporus, we see the darkest truth of Rome's obsession with youth and beauty. The boy became a canvas upon which power painted its fantasies. His body was not his own. His name survives in history only because of the cruelty inflicted upon him. And yet, in a twisted way, Sporus became immortal. His story endures not because Rome celebrated him, but because historians could not ignore the scandal. He is a shadow in the margins of history, a boy-turned symbol, a reminder that even the mightiest empire was built upon the broken lives of the powerless. If Sporus's story revealed the grotesque extremes of imperial appetite, the slave markets of Rome revealed its everyday machinery. Behind the marble facades and triumphal arches, another trade thrived, a commerce not in grain or gold, but in flesh. And among all commodities, the most prized, the most whispered about, was youth. The markets were open, public, and ruthlessly efficient. New arrivals, often captured in war or kidnapped from distant provinces, were displayed for inspection. Men were measured by their strength, women by their fertility, and children, especially boys, by their beauty. Dealers lined them up, stripped them bare, and advertised their qualities as if listing the features of a villa. Strong teeth, good posture, clear skin, no blemishes. Chalked boards sometimes hung around their necks, recording age, origin, and price. Writers from antiquity rarely described this trade in detail, but fragments survive. Juvenal sneered at wealthy Romans who scoured the markets for smooth-skinned boys with gentle voices. Martial joked in verses about friends who flaunted their beautiful slaves at banquets. Even Cicero, in private letters, made passing reference to friends who paid dearly for the freshness of youth. The very casualness of these remarks shows how normalized the trade was. A delicate boy could fetch more than a trained gladiator. Historians record prices soaring to astronomical sums, sometimes equal to the cost of a country estate. Wealthy patrons treated the acquisition of a beautiful child not only as pleasure but as status. To own such a treasure was to advertise refinement, taste, and superiority. Just as some boasted of rare marble or exotic parrots, others boasted of the boys who served them wine or recited poetry in their halls. But in the marketplace, even value was conditional. Youth was fleeting. A boy purchased at 12 might be paraded at banquets at 14, but by 18 he was already fading in the eyes of his master. The same beauty that raised his price ensured his disposability. Like fine fruit, he was cherished for his freshness, then discarded when bruised by time. And behind every transaction stood violence. These children were torn from families, marched in chains, and trained to please strangers. The markets masked this brutality with polished rhetoric, auctioneers' voices, ledgers, and contracts, but no amount of ink could soften the reality. The empire that prided itself on law and civilization had legalized the commodification of innocence. Pliny the Elder once wrote admiringly about Rome's capacity to acquire wonders from every land. Elephants from Africa, spices from Arabia, silks from China. Yet he did not pause to count among those imports the children dragged across seas and rivers, destined to be bought, sold, and displayed. They, too, were Rome's treasures, though their beauty came at the cost of their humanity. In this marketplace, value was measured not by character or ability but by appearance, by the smoothness of skin and the brightness of eyes. And for those trapped within it, every glance was a calculation, every whisper a judgment, every purchase a sentence. For the boys taken from the marketplace, the household became both sanctuary and prison. To the outsider's eye, they often lived in luxury, fed well, clothed finely, shielded from the back-breaking toil of field labor. But beneath that fragile veneer lay a deeper truth. Their privilege was always precarious, dependent on the whims of those who owned them. Inside Rome's aristocratic villas, such boys were not hidden. They were displayed. A master might place a beautiful youth at his banquet table to pour wine or play the lyre, knowing that guests would notice, admire, and envy. In these moments, the boy seemed elevated above ordinary slaves, his presence a symbol of refinement, his body a kind of living art. Yet this same visibility bound him in chains stronger than iron. He could not escape notice, nor expectation. His value depended on being perpetually pleasing. Some households trained boys in poetry, music, or philosophy, grooming them to serve as companions rather than mere servants. For a fleeting time, this education offered them status. They could move more freely through the house, converse with guests, even advise their masters in intimate settings. Yet the same hand that taught them to recite verses could strike them down if they failed to charm. A misplaced word, a moment of disobedience, a change in fashion, and privilege evaporated into punishment. Roman law made no distinction between the slave who labored in the fields and the boy who reclined in silks beside his master. Both were property. Both could be beaten, sold, or discarded at will. The only difference was visibility. The field laborer suffered in obscurity. The household youth suffered under the gaze of the elite, his every movement scrutinized, his beauty taxed to its limit. The contradiction was stark. The closer a boy was to the heart of Roman luxury, the more vulnerable he became. He might dine from golden plates but sleep in fear of being replaced. He might be praised as favored, yet never secure in that favor. The privileges he enjoyed were not protections but lures, keeping him compliant while reminding him how much he stood to lose. Writers of the age noticed this paradox. Seneca, in his Essays on Morality, observed with discomfort how masters surrounded themselves with delicate attendants, who lived in constant anxiety of displeasure. He hinted, though cautiously, that such arrangements corrupted both master and servant, binding them in a relationship of mutual degradation. But even Seneca, the philosopher of restraint, never demanded the system's end. His criticism was moral, not structural. For the boys, life was a balancing act. They learned to anticipate moods, to flatter, to silence their own feelings. They survived not through strength but through vigilance, always reading the expressions of those who held their fate. In a sense, they became performers long before stepping into the public spectacles of Rome. To outsiders, these youths embodied privilege. To themselves, they embodied fragility. They lived at the center of power yet remained powerless, their status glittering but unstable, their lives a fragile performance that could collapse at any moment. If the household was a stage, then the boys within it were expected to play their roles with flawless precision. Beauty was the foundation of their value. But beauty alone was never enough. To maintain favor, they had to be shaped, trained, disciplined, rehearsed, until their very existence became a performance. Roman aristocrats understood the power of spectacle, and they demanded it not only in arenas and theaters but also within their own homes. Young attendants were drilled in posture, movement, and voice. They were taught to walk gracefully, to pour wine without spilling a drop, to sing or recite in tones soft enough to please yet loud enough to impress a room. Even laughter had to be carefully measured. Never coarse, never intrusive, always flattering. Education became part of this grooming. Some boys were instructed in Greek poetry, in rhetoric, in the subtle art of conversation. Masters delighted in presenting them at banquets not merely as silent ornaments but as cultivated companions. To own a youth who could recite Homer or compose a clever epigram was to display refinement as well as wealth. But this cultivation was never for the boys' sake. It was not freedom they were being prepared for but performance. Others were trained for more physical displays. Acrobatic skills, dancing, even playing instruments like the cithara or flute, all became tools to heighten their allure. At feasts, a boy might be summoned to perform between courses, his body bending and swaying to the rhythm of applause. These entertainments blurred the line between art and object, reducing talent to another facet of desirability. The training was relentless because failure meant danger. A mistake could bring humiliation, punishment, or dismissal. A master who grew embarrassed before his peers would not forgive easily. And so the boys lived in constant rehearsal, every gesture practiced, every word weighed. Yet paradoxically, this training could elevate them above other slaves. A boy who mastered performance might be entrusted with closer access, allowed to stand nearer to his master, to whisper verses, to share in secrets. That intimacy was its own form of power. Fragile, dependent, but power nonetheless. Many clung to it, aware that their survival depended not just on beauty but on the ability to wield it with skill. Roman writers sometimes praised the refinement of households where such boys glittered like living jewels, but beneath the admiration lay unease. Petronius, in his Satyricon, mocked the obsession of elites who surrounded themselves with boys drilled to entertain, exposing the grotesque vanity of masters who treated children as luxury goods. Satire became the only safe way to critique what society had normalized. For the boys, however, There was nothing satirical in the training. Each lesson etched itself into their bodies and minds, until their true selves disappeared beneath layers of performance. To be pleasing was not a choice but a necessity, a mask they wore so constantly it fused to their skin. They were not merely serving Rome's hunger for beauty, they were being sculpted into the very instruments of that hunger. In Rome, the body was never simply flesh. It was a project, molded, polished, perfected, and displayed. For the boys drawn into elite households, their bodies became canvases upon which power and desire inscribed their demands. From the moment they entered service, they were measured not just by beauty but by its maintenance. Baths, oils, perfumes, and careful grooming were not luxuries but obligations. Hair was styled to fashion, skin kept smooth and unblemished, nails trimmed to perfection. In an age without modern cosmetics, elaborate rituals of care became the tools by which a boy's value was preserved. Diet, too, was controlled. A youth too thin suggested neglect. Too heavy, indulgence. Masters dictated what and how much they ate, balancing nourishment with appearance. A boy's body was monitored as closely as a prized horse or a gladiator in training, sculpted for both endurance and display. Some boys were subjected to harsher interventions. Castration, though officially frowned upon, remained a reality, especially for those prized for their voices. A pure, high-pitched tone could captivate audiences and masters alike, and so boys were mutilated to preserve it. The eunuch song became a symbol of refinement, but the price was irreversible. A body forever altered, arrested in a strange, perpetual youth. The Roman obsession with symmetry and proportion meant that even natural growth was policed. As boys matured, they faced a paradox. The very youthfulness that made them desirable was fleeting. Signs of manhood, facial hair, deeper voices, broader shoulders, threatened their status. Some masters sought to delay or disguise these changes, clinging to the fragile perfection of adolescence. The boys themselves learned to fear their own bodies, to view maturity not as liberation but as decay. The body became a prison of expectations. Every blemish, every scar, every mark of time carried consequences. To maintain favor, boys had to erase evidence of their own humanity. They were required to be eternal, unchanging, unmarred, perpetually pleasing. Yet the effort to project perfection carried hidden costs. The endless grooming, the anxiety over appearance, the punishments for imperfection, all carved deep wounds into their sense of self. They came to see their bodies not as their own but as property, objects to be managed for others' pleasure. Even illness or injury became a moral failing, proof that the project of perfection had faltered. The irony was sharp. Rome, a culture that celebrated conquest and virility, demanded from its most vulnerable youths a kind of fragile, artificial beauty, stripping them of the natural course of growth. The empire that conquered nations also conquered the bodies of children, reshaping them into symbols of wealth and power. The body was never free. It was always a project, one the boys themselves did not choose, but one they were forced to embody until time, fate, or a master's whim decided otherwise. In Rome, beauty was currency. But like all currency, it lost value over time. The most haunting reality for the boys in elite households was not only that their bodies were projects but that their beauty was temporary. Youth was their worth, and youth could not last. From the moment a boy entered service, a silent countdown began. His smooth skin, delicate frame, and unbroken voice carried him through the golden years of favor. But as his body matured, he approached the inevitable: obsolescence. Facial hair, deepening voices, and the marks of manhood transformed the very traits that once drew admiration into signs of decline. A boy who was praised as radiant one year could be dismissed as ordinary the next. The transformation was mercilessly fast, often occurring in the span of just a few seasons. Masters, obsessed with eternal novelty, rarely tolerated the reminders of time. When the first shadow of stubble appeared, when a boy's body broadened or his voice dropped, affection cooled. Some were quietly reassigned to menial tasks, their once cherished presence reduced to invisibility. Others were cast aside entirely, their years of cultivation and performance suddenly meaningless. This disposability was woven into the system. Rome's appetite for youth was insatiable, and as one boy faded, another was always waiting, fresh, unmarked, ready to take his place. The cycle of acquisition and abandonment fed the culture of possession, where no individual mattered, only the perpetual supply of beauty. For the boys themselves, the approach of obsolescence was terrifying. They learned to fear mirrors, to dread the signs of growth that nature imposed. Some clung desperately to their masters, hoping intimacy or loyalty might outlast the fleeting gift of youth. Others prepared in silence, knowing they would soon be discarded, resigned to a future without the protection or status beauty had once afforded them. There were exceptions. Rare cases where former favorites transitioned into trusted servants, companions, or even freedmen. But these stories were the exception, not the rule. For most, aging out of desirability meant a fall from grace, a descent from the center of luxury to the margins of obscurity. Roman poets hinted at this cruel cycle. Martial, in his sharp epigrams, mocked aging former favorites, their faces still powdered, their bodies desperately adorned, as they tried in vain to compete with the young. Satire captured what society preferred to ignore, that behind the glittering facade of youth lay the certainty of abandonment. The obsolescence of youth exposed the fragility of a system that thrived on ephemerality. Rome, in its hunger for beauty, consumed it quickly and ruthlessly, leaving behind those it had once exalted. For the boys, this truth was inescapable. Their greatest gift was also their greatest curse. To be young was to shine. To grow was to disappear. The most unsettling truth about Rome's treatment of boys was not merely that it happened, but that it was accepted, even admired. What today strikes us as predatory and cruel was, for many Romans, woven seamlessly into the fabric of daily life. Horror was normalized, and desire was celebrated. The elite did not see themselves as exploiters but as connoisseurs. To possess a beautiful boy was not a shameful indulgence but a sign of status, refinement, even taste. Banquets displayed them as ornaments, literature romanticized them as muses, and sculpture immortalized them as ideals of divine beauty. What we would call abuse was reframed as culture. Writers spoke openly of boys as objects of longing. Ovid offered advice on seduction that blurred the boundaries of consent. Martial's epigrams jested about affairs with page boys. Juvenal satirized nobles who paraded their favorites in public. These were not whispers in the shadows but subjects of mainstream commentary. The very visibility of the practice dulled its cruelty. At the heart of this normalization was Rome's obsession with hierarchy. To the elite, the desires of a master were unquestionable, while the resistance of a boy was irrelevant. Power justified passion, and passion excused cruelty. So long as hierarchy was preserved, master over slave, elder over youth, desire could masquerade as love, and exploitation as privilege. Even philosophy, Rome's supposed moral compass, offered little resistance. Stoic thinkers cautioned against excess, yet rarely condemned the institution itself. The problem, in their eyes, was not that boys were used but that men lacked moderation in doing so. Ethics, too, became complicit in disguising violence as discipline. Perhaps the most chilling sign of normalization was how the boys themselves were written out of the narrative. Their voices, their pain, their resistance, rarely recorded, barely acknowledged. History preserved the desires of the powerful, not the suffering of the powerless. And so the cruelty vanished behind layers of poetry, satire, and art, leaving us with beauty without its cost. Desire in Rome was not private. It was paraded, praised, woven into politics and performance. To own beauty was to wield influence, and to display it was to proclaim one's superiority. In this system, the destruction of children became not only accepted but celebrated, as a marker of civilization itself. This was Rome's paradox, an empire that built monuments to endurance and conquest but consumed the most fragile among them without hesitation. The horror was not hidden in shadows. It was lit by torches, sung in verse, carved in marble. And because everyone applauded, no one questioned. In Rome, nothing about these boys was entirely private. Their beauty was paraded, their presence displayed. They were ornaments at banquets, attendants at temples, companions at festivals. Their role was as much spectacle as service. In a culture obsessed with appearances, their visibility was unavoidable. And yet, behind the polished facade of oils and perfumes lay private realities that few dared to name. The same boys who stood in gleaming atriums, serving wine with practiced grace, often endured humiliation once the public gaze had shifted. Their worth depended on their ability to project delight and perfection, but the price was silence. The duality was striking. In public, they embodied refinement, symbols of luxury and civilization. To be seen with them enhanced a master's prestige, an advertisement of wealth and cultivated taste. The boy himself was less a person than a performance, a living emblem of Roman abundance. In private, the same boy might suffer degradations that stripped him of dignity. Masters who flaunted their refinement before peers could impose cruelty behind closed doors. Punishments for imperfection, coercion masquerading as intimacy, a steady erosion of selfhood. What Rome celebrated outwardly as art and beauty often concealed inward realities of abuse. This tension, between visibility and degradation, was central to Rome's moral blindness. Public display legitimized private exploitation. Because everyone saw the splendor, no one asked about the suffering. Applause drowned out protest, and laughter at a poet's epigram smothered the silence of the boys themselves. The boys lived in a constant performance. They learned to smile when they wanted to weep, to play roles that reassured their masters, to suppress the natural rebellion of youth. Survival demanded a mask. But wearing it came at a cost, the gradual hollowing of the self, the sense that one's life was never truly one's own. This was the final cruelty of Rome's system, not simply that children were used, but that their suffering was hidden beneath the very structures that claimed to celebrate them. Public admiration and private degradation were two sides of the same coin, inseparable and reinforcing. To the Roman elite, this contradiction was invisible. To the boys, it was inescapable. Their lives were consumed in the space between spectacle and silence, a reminder that Rome's glory was built not only on conquest abroad but also on the quiet devastation of its most vulnerable at home. Desire in Rome was not only cultural, it was economic. Beneath the poetry, the art, and the satire lay a marketplace where human beauty was bought, sold, and speculated upon like any other commodity. The exploitation of boys was sustained not simply by appetite but by profit. At Rome's great slave markets, youth commanded a premium. Traders displayed boys with the same calculation as jewels or horses, emphasizing smooth skin, unbroken voice, or delicate features. A child who fit the ideals of beauty could fetch staggering sums, equal to or greater than seasoned gladiators or skilled artisans. For the wealthy, to purchase a boy of exceptional beauty was to acquire both a status symbol and an investment. The economics did not end with the sale. Owners could parade their possessions for social advantage, but some turned desire into a business. A beautiful boy might be hired out for entertainment at banquets, his presence enhancing the host's prestige. Others became unofficial courtesans, their value extracted repeatedly for the gain of their masters. The line between private indulgence and commercial exploitation was often non-existent. This trade also fueled entire networks. Brokers who scouted provinces for promising children, dealers who specialized in training them for service, poets and artists who immortalized their beauty and in doing so, increased their market worth. The system was self-perpetuating. Desire created value, and value intensified desire. Even freedmen profited. A former favorite, if granted manumission, could himself become a procurer, trafficking the very kind of youth he once embodied. In this way, the cycle reproduced itself across generations, binding personal trauma into the structures of Roman commerce. What made this economy particularly insidious was its invisibility to the Roman conscience. Few questioned whether a price should ever have been attached to a child's body. The market was taken as natural, an extension of Rome's appetite for luxury. To critique the trade would have meant critiquing the foundations of elite society itself, a step few dared to take. Thus, desire in Rome was never just about longing. It was about wealth, exchange, profit, and power. The boys who glittered in the atriums of senators and emperors were not only objects of lust but assets in an economy that thrived on their disposability. Rome, the empire of law and order, codified conquest and property with meticulous care. Yet when it came to the most vulnerable, it reduced lives to price tags. The economics of desire revealed what Rome truly valued. Not the humanity of its children, but the currency of their youth. Wherever desire is commodified, cruelty follows close behind. For Rome's boys, degradation did not stop with purchase or possession. It continued in the violence of households, the jealousies of rivals, and the spread of disease that shadowed every encounter. Violence was both punishment and entertainment. A boy who displeased a master, whether by fatigue, hesitation, or a fleeting expression of reluctance, could be beaten, branded, or humiliated. Roman law provided little protection. As property, his body was subject to the whims of ownership. Even the educated elite joked about such brutality. Satirists described masters who whipped their favorites for sport, and audiences laughed, ignoring the silent terror behind the words. Jealousy added another layer of danger. Within elite circles, to own a particularly beautiful boy was to provoke envy. Rivals might spread rumors, attempt to seduce the boy away, or retaliate against him as a means of shaming his master. Inside households, the presence of a favorite often stirred resentment from wives, concubines, or even other enslaved youths, producing a climate of suspicion and hostility. The boy, caught at the center of these jealousies, became both a prize and a target. Then there was disease. Rome's obsession with youth meant that boys circulated in networks of sexual contact that were broad, exploitative, and unregulated. Physicians of the time, though skilled in diagnosing fevers and wounds, had little understanding of venereal illness. Symptoms were hidden, stigmatized, or simply ignored. The result was an undercurrent of infection that scarred bodies, shortened lives, and silently undermined the very beauty Rome prized. This triad, violence, jealousy, and disease, was more than personal tragedy. It was structural, inevitable within the system Rome had built. Violence maintained control, jealousy reinforced possession, and disease spread as the silent cost of indulgence. Together, they ensured that the promise of youth, once commodified, could only end in damage. Rome praised itself for order, law, and civilization. Yet within its villas and palaces, it permitted chaos to reign in the most intimate of spheres. The boys who seemed so radiant in marble and verse lived lives shadowed by bruises, whispered rivalries, and illnesses no one cared to name. The empire's cruelty did not always take the form of conquest on distant fields. Sometimes it was contained within a single body, worshipped in public, but ravaged in private. For a few, there was something that resembled safety, though it was fragile, fleeting, and bound entirely to another's whim. Favor could offer a boy temporary shelter, a reprieve from the harshest degradations. To be singled out as a deliciae, a darling, could mean better clothing, fine food, even a room apart from the crowded slave quarters. In a world of constant precarity, these gestures felt like lifelines. A favored boy might be allowed to ride in a litter beside his master, to wear jewels, or to be paraded proudly at feasts. He was treated not as common property but as something precious, almost untouchable. For a moment, he might believe himself seen, even loved. But favor was not love. It was a form of possession. The privileges it brought were inseparable from the vulnerability it concealed. Favor could be withdrawn as quickly as it was granted, replaced by punishment, neglect, or sale. The same master who caressed could cast aside. The boy's worth lay not in his humanity but in the intensity of another's desire. This fragility bred contradictions. Some boys clung to favor, learning to flatter, to anticipate moods, to guard their beauty as a means of survival. Others resented the gilded cage, sensing that the comforts they enjoyed were themselves instruments of control. The very silk that clothed them also bound them to their master's will. Writers of the age celebrated these relationships in poetry, immortalizing the boy's charm and the master's indulgence. But beneath the verse was an unspoken truth. The shelter of favor was never permanent. Time eroded beauty. Desire shifted elsewhere. What seemed like safety was only a pause in the cycle of exploitation, a brief calm before the inevitable decline. To live in favor was to live under a shadow. The boy might walk Rome's streets adorned like a prince, admired by passers-by, envied by other slaves. Yet he knew that his future could unravel in a single act of disobedience, or simply with the passing of years. Favor was not freedom. It was a gilded reprieve. For some, it delayed ruin. For none did it erase it. If favor offered a fleeting illusion of protection, slavery itself dismantled the very foundation of childhood, the family. To be enslaved in Rome meant that one's ties of blood, affection, and kinship could be severed at any moment. Nowhere was this more devastating than for children. Boys destined for the market of desire were often torn from their parents at conquest, seized as war booty, or sold by impoverished families crushed by Rome's taxes. Once uprooted, they entered a world where their lineage was erased. A child might never again hear the language of his mother, never see the village he once knew. In Rome, he became only a body, stripped of past, name, and kin. The legal structures of the empire reinforced this rupture. Enslaved people could not contract marriages recognized by law. Bonds of affection, between mother and child, siblings, or partners, were at the mercy of owners, who could sell, trade, or separate them without hesitation. Children born to enslaved women automatically belonged not to their mothers but to their master's estate. Family was thus reconstructed around the needs of power, not love. Within households, enslaved boys sometimes formed fragile kinships among themselves. Older youths guided younger ones, passing on survival strategies or small comforts. These surrogate families were tenuous, always vulnerable to separation. Yet they provided some semblance of belonging in a world intent on denying it. The exploitation of children for sexual purposes warped these structures further. A boy might find himself favored by a master, but in the process estranged from peers who envied or despised his position. Any possibility of natural family ties was replaced by dynamics of jealousy, competition, and coercion. Meanwhile, Roman elites celebrated their own households as the center of moral order. Philosophers praised the paterfamilias as guardian of family virtue, even as the same households consumed the children of other families torn apart by conquest and commerce. The paradox was staggering. The sanctity of Roman family life was preserved by the destruction of countless others. Chains were not always visible iron links. They were also legal codes, household hierarchies, and the erasure of a child's right to belong. For enslaved boys, the family was not a place of safety but a memory, or at best a fragile imitation recreated in shadows. In this way, Rome's glory rested on invisible absences, the missing fathers, mothers, and children whose lives were consumed to sustain the families of their conquerors. The story of Rome's boys was not uniform. It shifted with geography, custom, and the local economies that fed the empire's hunger for labor and beauty. To understand the exploitation of youth is to see how Rome's machinery adapted to the cultures it conquered, bending regional traditions into the shape of imperial desire. In Greece, Rome inherited a long legacy of eroticized pedagogy. The imagery of youths, idealized in marble, poetry, and philosophy, merged with Roman appetites. Greek boys, trained in gymnasia, were prized for their athletic beauty, their bodies sculpted to ideals already celebrated in art. What had once been framed as mentorship in Greek cities was refracted through Roman slavery, stripped of reciprocity and choice. From the East, especially Asia Minor and Syria, came boys whose exoticism fascinated Roman elites. Writers described their delicate features, their different languages and mannerisms, as though foreignness itself enhanced desirability. These children were tokens of conquest, living proofs of Rome's reach. Their strangeness was consumed as spectacle. From the northern provinces, Gaul, Germania, and Britain, the trade was different. Here, boys were valued less for refinement than for their rarity, their supposed wildness. Blonde hair and fair skin were exotic markers in the streets of Rome. Captured in war or sold by desperate families, they became objects of curiosity, sometimes paraded in ways that emphasized their foreign origins. Egypt and North Africa contributed another layer. Egyptian boys were associated with music, dance, and performance, often trained for spectacles that blurred the lines between art and exploitation. In North Africa, Berber and Nubian children were trafficked along caravan routes, their lives entangled with the empire's commercial arteries. Even within Italy, the treatment of enslaved boys reflected local economies. In rural villas, they were laborers first, sometimes spared the sexualized marketplace of the cities. In urban Rome, however, the pressure was acute. The proximity to wealth, theater, and spectacle created a culture where beauty was currency, and boys were most vulnerable. Despite these differences, one constant remained. Conquest turned children into commodities. Regional variations shaped the style of exploitation, but never its substance. Everywhere, boyhood was interrupted, family ties severed, and humanity reduced to trade. The empire's mosaic of provinces thus became a mosaic of suffering, each tile reflecting Rome's ability to absorb and reconfigure local lives into its system of dominance. From the marble of Athens to the forests of Germania, from the sands of Egypt to the streets of Rome, the story was the same. Childhood bent beneath the weight of empire. Rome's appetite for children was not sustained by appetite alone. It was secured by law, legitimized by contract, and woven into the empire's financial structures. The boy was not only a body to be desired but also an entry on a ledger, a commodity whose value could be assessed, mortgaged, and exchanged like grain or cattle. Roman law codified this reduction with brutal clarity. The enslaved child was res, a thing. He could not own property, could not testify in court, could not refuse. His body was his master's property, and that property included the right of sexual use. Legal scholars such as Ulpian wrote as if cataloging tools, debating liability if a boy were injured, or clarifying the obligations of sellers to disclose defects, as though a child's suffering were equivalent to the cracking of pottery. Finance turned this abstraction into daily practice. Boys were bought at auction, their prices fluctuating with age, appearance, and region of origin. Traders kept careful records. A younger boy, not yet marked by labor, could command extraordinary sums, especially if praised for beauty. Contracts might stipulate training, as musicians, dancers, or actors, so that the buyer's investment would yield greater returns. A child became both product and project, his body a financial asset shaped for future profit. Credit systems incorporated these lives as collateral. Wealthy Romans mortgaged enslaved persons to secure loans. Children were included in inventories alongside livestock and furniture. Their bodies thus entered not only households but also the abstract circuits of Roman finance, invisible yet essential to the empire's wealth. Even freedom was commodified. Masters could manumit a favored boy, but often at a price. Legal mechanisms like the peculium allowed an enslaved youth to accumulate a small fund, sometimes purchasing his own release. Yet this system was less opportunity than trap. The boy's ability to earn depended on the very exploitation that enslaved him. Law and money did not merely reflect exploitation. They sustained and normalized it. By binding childhood to property rights and economic exchange, Rome transformed private violence into public order. Desire was made legal, commerce was made moral, and suffering was made invisible beneath the weight of contracts. To see the enslaved child in Roman law is to glimpse how deeply commodification penetrated. The boy was not only someone's possession, he was a unit of value, a transferable asset, a number in the empire's great account book. Yet even within a system designed to crush individuality, children were not only victims. They carved out spaces of resistance. Small, fragile, often fleeting, but real. Agency existed, though constrained, and at times it altered the course of a life. Some resisted through defiance. Ancient sources describe enslaved youths who ran away, branded afterward with marks of shame when caught. The risk was enormous. Capture meant beatings, mutilation, or death. Yet the act of flight itself was a declaration that a boy's body, though owned in law, still carried within it a will that refused ownership. Others resisted less visibly. Silence could be a weapon. So could withholding affection, or feigning incompetence at the entertainments demanded of them. In the intimacy of households, boys sometimes learned to manipulate the moods of their masters, turning apparent compliance into subtle control. They studied desire and weakness, exploiting them in small ways to secure a scrap more freedom or protection. Rarely, fortune tilted toward liberation. A handful of boys rose from degradation into favored freedmen, manumitted as a reward for loyalty or beauty. Some, like Sporus, though his story was bound to tragedy, were elevated to the visibility of imperial circles. Others, once freed, built lives as artisans, scribes, or performers, their survival itself a testament to resilience. There were also stories of solidarity. Among slaves in large households, bonds formed, offering children emotional refuge and occasional protection. These communities could shield the vulnerable, pass along survival strategies, or, though seldom recorded, aid in attempts to flee. Literature occasionally hints at resistance in the voice of the child imagined as speaking back. Poets would sometimes write from the perspective of a boy rejecting advances, his no echoing faintly across centuries. Whether these were real voices or literary inventions, they suggest that contemporaries recognized the possibility of refusal, however dangerous it might be. But escape, true escape, was rare. For every story of survival, countless others were silenced by violence or anonymity. Resistance was often swallowed by the machinery of empire, unrecorded, its traces visible only in gaps, in whispers, in the knowledge that even in the darkest systems, children did not surrender their humanity completely. To remember these rare acts is to resist Rome's attempt to erase them. Agency, though constrained, survived. And in the flicker of that survival, we glimpse the stubbornness of hope. Rome has long since fallen, its palaces crumbled, its emperors reduced to names in books. But the children who lived and suffered under its rule did not vanish into abstraction. Their stories, fragmentary, muted, refracted through the voices of their masters, still haunt us. They remind us that the empire's glory was built not only on conquest and marble but also on the bodies of the most vulnerable. The patterns set in Rome did not end with Rome. Across centuries, echoes resound. The commodification of children, their reduction to labor, pleasure, or profit, reappears in different guises. In the households of medieval courts, in the slave markets of the Atlantic world, in the factories of the industrial age. The faces change, the languages shift, but the dynamics of power, desire, ownership, and silence remain recognizable. Even now, in a world that calls itself modern, children are still bought and sold, trafficked across borders, exploited in ways that echo Roman markets. Law and finance, then as now, can obscure suffering behind contracts and numbers. We congratulate ourselves on progress, yet newspapers continue to reveal how young bodies are treated as assets, currency, or disposable tools. But history also leaves us with responsibility. To remember Rome's enslaved children is to refuse their erasure. It is to recognize how easily societies normalize what should be unthinkable. It is to hear, in the silence of their voices, a call to listen more carefully today, to those whose stories are still being muted, whose humanity is still being denied. The echoes are not only warnings, they are reminders of resilience. Even in Rome, amid brutality, children resisted, survived, carved out slivers of agency. To honor them is to insist that their lives mattered, that beauty and pain, joy and terror, passed through them just as through any child today. Time distances us from the Roman Empire, but not from the questions it raises. How do we treat the powerless? What do our systems of law and finance conceal? What do we normalize that future generations may judge as barbaric? The story of Rome's enslaved children is not ancient alone. It is present, vibrating still in our world, demanding that we learn, that we act, that we refuse to forget.